Again, optical color being used when you place colors side by side to create new colors. You're not actually mixing it on a palette. The receding and advancing of color, you'll notice in this piece here how rich and pure these oranges and yellows and golds and greens and dark browns are. But as we go farther and farther in the distance, the color becomes softer, mixed down, tinted more with white, more white, more white. Not pure, not harsh, just very faint. We also have the contrast between cool colors receding in the background and these very rich, warm, sunshiny colors. Although the artist shows that the sun is hitting these hills too, but they're farther away, so the light is diffused. Arbitrary color, again, when you're dealing with abstraction or expressionism. In this case, it is definitely a focal point of the piece, almost a contrast between the two different Mrs. Matisses. Alright. The expression in the of Van Gogh's Night Cafe, or even just the emotional qualities of what it looks like in the winter under a full moon. And then, of course, color is deeply used in symbolism. Religions, cultures, politics. And finally, the psychology of color, how color is used to manipulate our minds and our feelings. And here is the slide. Again, this PowerPoint is on Moodle. The psychology of color kind of goes over some things. Okay. The next element we talked about was called texture. Actual texture is something you can feel with your hands, with your sense of touch. Yes, I have the window open. Sorry for that. Painting with impasto. Some artists who work two-dimensionally paint extra thick to give actual texture to a two-dimensional piece. Impasto refers to painting something very thickly, like this beginning of this painting of this face, this eye. Close-up lower view of one of Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, so you can see how thick that he actually did paint. It's a lot of paint. Actual textures, changing the bark of a tree to yarn bombing, so changing not only the color but the expected texture of tree bark to another pattern, but the softer texture of yarn. Actual texture and implied texture in one thing, where the stone you can touch is very cold and hard, but yet the sculptor created the illusion that it is soft, supple flesh. So it's kind of both. Contrast and actual texture, again, the very smooth, polished arm and abdomen to the roughness of the unfinished faces. And the actual texture of somebody like Giacometti, the dog, the bronze, very, very textured. But then you have the visual textures, and we went over this piece in detail when it came to the handling of all the paint, the different fabrics, dog fur, metal, wood, cloth, glass, everything, every possible different texture you can imagine in one painting. And the functions of texture to create naturalistic appearances. So the texture of leaves, the texture of tree bark, the texture of the stones. And then the farther back we get, the less definition and the less texture. Texture is often used for expressive effect, not only in sculpture, but also in painting, the rough, scratchy painting. Texture is also created from pattern, whether it be the blinds on your window or the vent that your air conditioning blows out of. Next, we're on to space. Okay, your picture plane, your illusion of depth, the shallow picture plane, a deep picture plane. And creating space is all about, are you trying to make it look realistic or not? So naturalism. And some of the earliest ways that they created the illusion of depth was, first and foremost, overlapping. Overlapping was really the first way they could figure out to make things look like they were in front of each other, like they had some depth. Whether it be ancient Greece, they knew which side of the shield to show. And they knew to show that, wow, this is a tongue twister, they knew to show that shield in front of that shield, and then that shield in front of that figure. But everything's very flat, so overlapping was your basics. All the way up to the Dark Ages. Okay? Another way to create the illusion of depth was size. So the closer we are to an object, the larger it seems to be. The farther away an object, the smaller it seems to be. So she's not a giant. She's just closer to us than that house. As is the woman in pink here. Now, there is an exception to size. We talked about this, the hierarchical scaling. Hierarchy simply means order of importance. So, the Pharaoh Tai was not a giant, he was the Pharaoh. And when you're the king, you get to be the biggest G.I. Joe in the boat. So, that's when you can tell the difference, like they weren't drawing giants. Another way to create the illusion of depth is placement. Our field of vision feels like things that are closer to us are toward the bottom of our field of vision, and things that are farther away are closer to the top of our field of vision. So that's how we translate our reality. However, not always the case. Who is closer to the viewer in this painting? Is it Muhammad? Is it these, sacred virgins? There's really no telling what's in front and what's behind. The tree is back there, and there is some overlapping, but there's no real discussion of depth in terms of how far away is Muhammad from this action here. Now, how do you create depth? Well, the first way is something called perspective. Those were the many ways you create depth. I apologize. The last way of creating depth is two pieces. Perspective comes in two sections. The first is atmospheric perspective, and that is the softening of everything from color to light to texture until it becomes a mush, nothing in the distance, just a horizon. That is showing that depth through air particles, so everything gets diffused out. And then the big one it took forever to understand was linear perspective, which is a mathematical, not numeric in terms of like you have to be able to add or subtract, but by using straight edges and straight lines and points, you could describe and lay out any form of depth that you wanted on a two-dimensional surface. And that's why they mean mathematical perspective. It's not necessarily a formula, it's just an approach. So, behold the king, a one-point perspective. Doesn't get more ridiculous than that. And as you'll see later in the principles, or as you've seen in the principles, it's also the king, a focal point. So in this one, this technically isn't a three-dimensional work. This is a 2.5 dimensional, what they call a relief, which means it protrudes from a flat back. It's not in the round. So it's still very much a two-dimensional piece of work with some bumps on it, basically. Another way to create depth was something called foreshortening, where, and this is really important for organic things, when they're closer to you, they get bigger, and so you have to really push this perspective away. So, like in this piece here, we know Christ doesn't have little bitty tiny pointy feet, but they're way farther away than his head. His head is closer to us. His hands are closer to us even still. So again, this one, like probably in this piece, even his feet should be a little bit bigger, being closer to us. They were doing pretty good at the chest, but if we were really straight on, these feet would be mostly just toes here. And then back to perspective, linear perspective, 2-point perspective, multiple points of 2-point perspective. Okay? And then isometric perspective, where we don't recede as we get farther away from the viewer. We don't recede as we get farther away from the viewer. We stay the same thickness all the way around, but we do show thickness. Whereas 3-point perspective is for extreme, like Spider-Man comic books. So isometric perspective you'll see a lot in games like The Sims, Asian art. A lot of Japanese and Chinese they don't really, this top of this bridge, or this top of this wall into the castle, it's the same thickness here as it is back here, even though since it's getting farther away from us it should get smaller, but it doesn't. Diagrams, okay, so they want to show thickness and sizes, but they don't really want to show real receding depth. Whereas in 3-point perspective, it's a super exaggeration. It almost looks like these lines bend and drain into a opening in the universe. Now, some exceptions, of course, not only with ancient art, but then later with modern art, is multiple perspectives. Side view, front view, side view, front view, side view, all in one thing. Same happens here in Cubism. Multiple perspectives. Is the knife floating in the air? Is it laying on the table? Is the table laying down? Is the guitar laying on the table? Everything's kind of in motion. The table itself seems flat here, but then all of a sudden you realize that the whole tabletop goes here. Now, the use of space in sculpture. We talked about in the round sculptures versus that guy. This is not in the round. It's got a flat back, so it's more of a wall plaque. These images, however, are in the round. The use of space. Okay, closed form, open form. And then we talked about the use of space in assemblage and installation, where most installations are temporary, but you see a space and you're like, what would look good there, blah, 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 and you do it. Now, most of them are temporary, much like our melting men. But for a little while, this audience of Icemen were in this giant stadium of steps, taking in the show of us humans walking by. Okay? So that's a review of all of that craziness. Okay? So understanding the functions and all the elements is going to be a key portion of that test, along with the principles that I've already given you. So that's a wrap for this review. Feel free to email me any questions you have, any concerns you have, If you don't understand the instructions on the test, just let me know. I have a feeling that there's going to be a lot of A's this time, since there's really, sad to say, no way to keep you from cheating. So, there you go. This will be split into two pieces. Well, actually, this might be split into three pieces because it's about 41 minutes long of a review. So, but that's less than a class. So, hang in there and hope you're all doing well. Bye.